Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to our summer short lectures. And today I am the speaker. My name is Bolun. I just joined Earth Environmental Department this January. Okay, and today we are going to talk about energy storage and whether it is increasing or decreasing carbon emission in the grid, and which really come down to a problem of incentives and how do we control them. Okay, now let's actually go back to where we started. What was our vision back in 2012? And this is a picture from DOE, pretty laid out what we want to achieve with energy storage, like about 8 years ago. Okay, now and this is a pretty clear illustration. We want storage to reduce carbon emission, and by replacing fossil fuel power plants, we want storage to increase economic value of renewables when the solar and storage can provide a new income revenue for its owners. Okay, and now, well, 8 years has passed, and obviously a lot of have happened during these 8 years. But let's see what we are at. Of course, now energy storage is becoming a new revenue stream, and they actually have a pretty, it's actually doing pretty well, but not necessarily related to renewables. Okay. On the other hand, unfortunately, we do not have any direct evidence that energy storage are replacing fossil fuel power plants. Okay. So this is, we know they may happen indirectly somehow, which we talk about later, but we don't have any direct evidence of that is happening. Okay. And so like immediate decrease carbon dioxide emission and replace fossil fuel power plants, I don't think this is happening, at least so far. Okay. Renewables, this is somewhere starting to get a bit complicated. We know there are projects that you have co-locate storage to charge from renewables, but is that really increasing the economic value of renewable? Not necessarily. Currently in the market, there is little benefit. If you are a renewable producer, there's actually little benefit purely from an economic point of view that you install storage for the renewable energy. Okay, and there's, of course, there's a value that you stack other service onto it, but if you're talking about renewable alone, not necessarily true. Okay, so let's take a look at what happened over the storage application from 2012, and it really can be categorized over whether the application increased, decreased, or somewhere complicated about carbon emission. Okay, first, decreased carbon emission, we have two applications that we are sure they are decreasing carbon emission. One is electric vehicles. Okay, now, so even if you charge your electric vehicle using the electricity generated from fossil fuel, still it will improve the carbon emission because the overall efficiency is better. Okay, and if you can charge electric vehicle from renewable resources, that's even better. Okay. Co-located energy storage, that literally means you install an energy storage next to the renewable generator geographically. Okay, and this is actually the only well-defined mechanism that they incentivize storage to mitigate, to integrate renewable and reduce carbon emission. Okay, so if the storage owner proved that like 80% or higher, at least 80% of the storage energy is charged from the renewables and next to it, it receives a pretty nice discount for tax credits. Okay. On the other hand, we are pretty sure there are two applications, actually two very popular applications of storage that are definitely increasing carbon emission. One is called non-wire alternative. That basically means you, instead of building a transmission line, you can build an energy storage. Okay, now this is actually getting very popular, especially in the US, where we have a more scattered system. Okay, for example, in places like Long Island or or Cape Cod, Massachusetts, or some mountain areas, it's actually much more economical to build a battery there instead of build a new transmission line. Okay, but obviously battery has a much worse efficiency than transmission line. So in this case, it is consuming more energy in general and increasing carbon emission. Okay, and for frequency regulation, this is a more maybe less familiar to many people, but this basically means a service that uses batteries to mitigate imbalances in the grid. Okay, and so in power grid, we need to maintain instantaneous balance between supply and demand. Okay, and there will always be fluctuation. I use the battery to charge and discharge. This is actually started as the one of the first grid scale application for batteries, and it used to be pretty successful, but now there's a market saturation issue because it's a relatively small market, and we have many battery that want to join into the market. Okay, now it's kind of interesting that in this market, batteries are replacing some fossil fuel generators because they do a better job. They have much better response speed compared to all the other thermal generators. But we're pretty sure these batteries are charged from fossil fuel resources. Okay, and counting in their inefficiency, they actually increase the carbon emission. For example, in one of the electricity market, PJM, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland area, the system operator have a well-structured control rules that they will increase the generation from fossil fuel power plant to compensate batteries, providing frequency regulation if they see those batteries are low on energy. Okay, so this we're pretty sure they're charging from fossil fuel. Okay, and somewhere complicated here, price arbitrage. That basically means you connect battery on the grid to charge and discharge based on the price, and also peak shaving. When the peak when you have a peak in the system, this is actually very similar to price arbitrage. You use battery to shave off the peak and move it to the valley. And how much battery is contributing to carbon emission here is actually a little bit complicated. And if you go to the literature, you see you find a lot of opposite studies. Some studies it is increasing carbon emissions, some studies it's reducing, and they have very different assumptions about the system and about the resource portfolio, how much renewable that is already there. Okay. Another application is residential batteries, and this is also a very intuitive concept. And people have PV in their home, battery in their home, so they can charge their battery from the PV to use their renewable energy. This is actually also a little bit complicated because first, if you don't charge those PV energy, those PV goes to the grid, and that does not necessarily mean those energy are going to be wasted. It's probably going to be used somewhere else, right? On the other hand, if you have the battery in your home, based on the current utility tariff, the utility rate, there's very little incentive, at least in the US, to use that battery to be energy independent, to consume the PV energy you generate yourself. So this is also a little bit complicated application, depending on the system resource portfolio and incentives. Okay, and if you look further, all these applications, even those, including those that decrease carbon emission, it is not really maximizing battery's potential as we imagine that battery can harvest the renewable energy that could otherwise wasted. We cannot able to integrate them to the grid. Okay, there's none of this application is trying to do is able to achieve that. Okay, now let's see. Now this problem really boils down to a chicken and egg problem. Okay, do we want the renewable first or storage first, right? Now, the ideology behind this is these renewables and storage are complementary resources. Wind and solar generations are intermittent, okay? And storage can mitigate the fluctuation. For example, here in this plot, this is an example of a wind generation. And you use storage, you can obviously shave off the peak generation from the wind and move it to the valley, so you have a much more stable wind power generation. Remember that in the power grid, we must maintain instantaneous balance between supply and demand, okay? So storage kind of needs renewable to perform its decarbonization functionality. Storage cannot decarbonize the grid on its own. It needs the presence of renewable, and it has to be of some scale, okay? And also on the other hand, renewables need storage to be competitive in the market. Okay, now this is basically what we imagined back in 2012, according to the DOE picture. Okay, now what's the reality here is the only way we are doing this is, again, collocate renewable and storage, but this is a very intuitive concept, right? You build a storage next to renewable and you make sure storage charge from renewable, but this is not a very efficient design. So basically, because this is, again, this is the problem of the scale of the system, right? You don't need you don't need to put a storage physically next to each renewable, right? You can aggregate those renewable, and that in that case, it will be much more efficient that use a single storage, and then you based on the system dispatch, right? Some alternative approach. There are cases that we can boost up the renewable penetration first, but then there's one idea is use natural gas as one of the transitioning fuel, okay, because it have some lower emission relatively, and has much more flexibility. It's more flexible, okay. But on the other hand, then we will have this is actually really an intermediate solution, and we will have some tough time withdraw from this, right? And also the carbon tax, we will also talk about this in detail later, but the carbon tax may or may not help. It again depends on your resource portfolio in the system. Okay, if you have a system like New York, right, where most of the time thermal generator is the one that sets the market price, charging carbon tax will simply increase the social cost for electricity, right? And not necessarily help the renewables in this case, okay? And for storage only, this is actually what we're going to talk about today. We really need, so here it basically means we are installing a storage. We are not placing a storage physically next to renewable, but we want to use dispatch a storage device to systematically facilitate the integration of renewable energy. Okay, and that's actually not happening in the grid, although this is seems to be a pretty obvious concept. Now the reason is really that the power system dispatch only saves money. This is why this dispatch is called economic dispatch. So every resources integrate into the grid, and the system operator clears the market based on the cost. Okay, this is like a resource allocation problem, and the storage obviously can charge or discharge based on its need. Okay, now this actually goes down to a basic ideology of the electricity market, which is a homogeneous market. That means all the product, all the electricity, although they are generated by different sources, okay, they are essentially the same. No. Typical counterexample is a market. It's a market for apple, right? You go to supermarket, there are 10 varieties of apples, each come with their own prices. But for electricity, at least in the classic market design, we think all electricity are the same. The only difference is the cost for generating them. Okay, but this is starting to no longer be true, because once now we have renewable, we have storage, maybe tomorrow we have some other new technology, and they are becoming very different. And we have to acknowledge the diversity in the generation resources. For example, here we have at least these 3 dimensions: flexibility, reliability, and sustainability. Okay, so the most traditional thermal, obviously not sustainable, but it's flexible, means we can change their output based on our demand, based on the demand. Okay, we can control them. And it's reliable, meaning once we set a certain generation amount we want, it can keep generating that. It's reliable. Okay. On the other hand, wind and solar, sustainable, flexible, but not reliable. Okay. And this is actually always a little bit of a misconception that the wind and solar is not flexible. The wind and solar power is actually pretty flexible. We can change how much you generate. For example, for wind, we can change their pitch angle. For solar, we can change their orientation, and also we can change the volt. For PV, we can change the voltage and current to adjust the total output power. Okay, it just they are not reliable, because how much the maximum amount they can generate depends on the weather. Okay. Another extreme example is nuclear. Nuclear, yeah, although it's nuclear, it don't really emit CO2, so we can give we count it as a sustainable, carbon-free resource, and it's very reliable. Okay, but it's not flexible at all. It basically has to do the same generation. We cannot change how much it generates. We cannot turn it off. Okay. And hydro is actually the best resources here. It's flexible, reliable, and sustainable. Okay, and that's why you see in areas with a natural advantage, like Switzerland, Norway, Quebec, Canada, and also Washington State in the U.S. They already achieved a very close to a carbon-free electricity there, because they have a lot of hydro. Okay. And also this is really where we want storage to be, right? It's flexible, it's more or less reliable, although we have an energy limit, and it's sustainable. But whether we can put storage here or not really depends on how we control storage in the first place. Okay, it's control sensitive, unlike all the other resources. Okay, now what we can do now? And here I'm trying to lay out a near-term solution here. Oops. Which is one, although this power system dispatch only say price, the good news is all the carbon-free resources happen to be cheap. Okay, and this, you can see this market supply curve in New York ISO. On the y-axis, it's the price or the marginal cost for different resources, and you can see all the renewable resources, wind, renewable, and water. They happen to be very cheap. Okay, and in this case, they are all somewhere below $10 per megawatt hour. Okay, so if we can control batteries to only charge with market price, it's cheap. It is highly likely that the battery is charging from renewable resources in this case. Okay. And this may not be the perfect plan, but at least this is the plan that it could work. And okay. And here is just a little bit of a background review on how market settles things. And usually this is where people started loaded with mathematical equations to explain the mathematical model. But let's just do this very, let's just do a very simple overview here. So the objective of power economic dispatch, okay, is to minimize the total cost, and the cost is bidded by the generators to meet the demand subject to power grid constraints. Okay, and then you have different resources. You have wind, solar, nuclear, coal, natural gas, and oil, which is more expensive. And what the system operator do is really they see the demand and they allocate the resources. This is essentially a resource allocation problem, but may subject to the grid security constraint and some dynamic constraints. Okay, but definitely if you are cheaper resources, you get to dispatch at a higher priority. Okay, and then the electricity price is called marginal pricing, and it is physically defined as at any given time interval the cost of generating 1 more megawatt of electricity. Okay, so which essentially means it's marginal. Okay, and the resource from which this electricity generated is called the marginal fuel. Okay, which is the type of generation that sets the price. So basically, this means if you see the market price, the real-time market price, it's $10 per megawatt hour or below, this is highly likely that this amount of energy, if you consume more energy now, if you want to consume 1 more megawatt of electricity when price is below 10, it's very likely that then that incremental amount of energy would be generated from renewable resources that otherwise would be wasted. It will be curtailed. Okay, and now storage can participate in the market. Storage does not really have much of a, it has cost of degradation, but still on top of that, it's a merchant resource. Okay, so storage need to determine the price at which it wants to pay to get recharged and the price and at which it wants to sell. It's basically a merchant. Okay, and of course, yeah, if you are a smart enough merchant, you know to make X less than Y. But here, if we enforce X, okay, to be 10, so we make it a necessary condition that storage can only charge from the grid when price is lower than 10, then we are likely to operate the energy storage on sustainable energy. Okay, in this case. Okay. Now the problem is locational sensitive. Now I'm going to talk about doing a case study in New York. So now our problem we want to operate. We take the perspective of a storage owner that want to arbitrage in the electricity market. We make money by buy energy when price is low and sell when the price is high. Okay, but now we are subjecting to one more sustainability rule. Okay, it's price. We only recharge when price is it's lower than $10. Okay, and then this is and how much money we can make is very much dependent on the location. Okay, here this is in New York, and New York is actually a very diverse state in terms of the distribution of different resources. In the North Zone, this is where the majority of wind farm locates in the North Zone. Okay, and if you see this is a real-time price distribution for 2018, and 15% of the time prices are lower than $10 per megawatt hour, and that roughly means 15% of the time some renewable resources are on the marginal. Okay, and if you go to Long Island, it looks very differently. Obviously, Long Island it has more it's dominated by oil and natural gas generators. Okay, and only less than 4% of the time, price is lower than $10. Okay, and the reason the cost is kind of distribution is there's a transmission bottleneck between upstate and to New York City and Long Island, which is somewhere around there, as I labeled here. Okay, so now let's talk okay, yeah, this is another look from New York, from the New York system operator report in 2018. This is actually a pretty messy plot, but a messy picture, but we can just focus on here in the North Zone, and the light green, the bright green is the color for the wind generator. Okay, so you can see in 2018 about, yeah, depending on the season, around 10% of the time the wind generation is set, it's the marginal resource is setting the price. Okay, and then you go to the island, basically most of the time prices are set by fossil fuel generations, natural gas, oil. Okay, so let's take a look at the result. So what I did here is we simulate the arbitrage using a 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt hour battery in North Zone, okay, using the North Zone market price, and in the island zone, okay, using the price from the island, okay, in 2018. And here we compare two control design. One is we are mindful with emission, so we only recharge, so emission aware, which means we only recharge when price is lower than 10. And the other is a comparison, is we don't care about emission, we just try to maximize our profit. And the range here, for example, in the North Zone, if you do emission aware, and the revenue you get for 2018 is between 32 to 46. And this range is based on the control strategy. Okay, and 32 it's the one that you use the simplest, because we are doing real-time price arbitrage. So to do that, we need to forecast the price in the first place, and there will always be error in the forecast. Okay, and 32 here means more like a lower bound. Okay, we use the dumbest forecast, and this is definitely achievable in practice. We are using basically in this case we use day-ahead price as the forecast for real time, and day-ahead price published 1 day ahead. So this is definitely something that's doable in practice. And the 46, the higher end, is we assume the battery can predict market prices perfectly. This obviously impossible in practice, but this gives us a higher bound. Okay, and you can see the clear difference now. In general, if you don't care about emission, Long Island, you make more money in Long Island, because Long Island actually is a pretty constrained area. It has very limited transmission capacity with rest of New York and to the other state, and oftentimes it needs to start up very expensive oil generation. That's why the price is very high in Long Island. But if you are doing emission aware control, the battery get more money in North Zone. Okay, because this is where there's more renewables. Okay, and we look at the total amount of energy charged in North Zone. If you enforce emission aware control, you reduce your energy charge by about half the total amount of energy charged during 2018. In Long Island, it's about only reduced. It's about I would say 15%, somewhere around that. Okay. And here the third table here shows how frequently. So when renewable is marginal, how frequently the battery is being charged. Okay. That means when renewable is at the marginal resources at any particular time period, what is the percentage that the battery is charging? Okay, and you can see when you reinforce emission aware, it definitely increase the overall percentage. But for comparison, because as we mentioned before, when renewable is marginal, that typically means the price is low. It's very low. So still, it's very, very likely that storage is charging, okay, from those resources, from the renewable resources. Okay, but that's not. But in the comparison case, when renewable is not as marginal, the storage is also likely it can also be charged, right? So this is the difference here. Okay, now based on this simulation result, let's do some money calculation. Okay, to give us a sense about what kind of incentive we might want to provide to storage. One way is we can calculate the equivalent of carbon tax here, okay, or carbon price. So here, if you generate 1 megawatt of energy from thermal resources, and the emission is likely somewhere around 2 tons of CO2, okay? And we can calculate the equivalent CO2 tax, which is the difference. Okay, so basically by CO2, we are trying to say we ask storage to only recharge from renewable resources, but we compensate the difference in revenue. As we showed before, if you only ask storage to recharge from renewable, it makes less money in the market. So we compensate that, and one way we can compensate that is in the form of carbon tax. Okay, and we can calculate the per unit, per megawatt of it. Okay, in this case we shouldn't call it carbon tax. Actually, it's the equivalent of carbon tax, which can call like carbon reduction incentive. Okay, so we divide the difference in the market revenue by the clean energy charged, and also counting the round tripping efficiency. Okay, and in this case, in the Northstone, we ended up with a carbon price about our carbon reduction incentive about $11 to $19 per ton of carbon. Okay, and in Long Island is about 10 times higher, obviously. And I just looked up the carbon price in Europe. Okay, Europe has a carbon trading system, and so it has a new carbon price every day. And it's actually not so bad. It's a 25 euro per ton of carbon. So actually for the compensation we were providing it, to the Northstone, at least, this is a sensible number. Okay, this is doable in practice. And actually, one more point I'd like to make here is the simulation we performed earlier, we haven't taken degradation into account. If we take degradation into account, that would actually even lower the battery revenue, unfortunately. But that also means that this carbon tax, this carbon price will also get reduced, which makes it even just more justifiable in practice. Of course, the other way is tax credit. Now, this is something that is being used in Europe, but in US, sorry. But so far it's only applied for co-located storage. Okay, that means so on the extreme here, if you recharge 100% from renewable resources for the storage, you receive a 30% investment tax credit, prorated over 5 years. So if we assume the 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt storage costs about 1 million, that's about like 69,000 equivalent of tax credit paid over per year for 5 years. And that's really, in this case, you actually have a pretty nice business case in the North Zone, and even for Long Island, it's comparable to the storage operation without considering carbon emission. Okay. And this is a quick picture about distribution of carbon price or carbon tax in different area of the world. So you can see here actually 10 to 20 is very reasonable, a very reasonable number. And if you go to area, Switzerland, Sweden, the carbon tax is pretty high. And they actually have, as I mentioned earlier, carbon tax will start to be very effective once renewable is already competing with fossil fuel. And I think that's one of the reasons and the carbon tax becomes so high there, because they already have a pretty significant amount of renewable already. Okay. So what's next? This design I mentioned earlier, mentioned today, it's really more like a very near-term fix-up, because it's try to follow the concept of the market design currently, that we only use price as a reference. Okay. But moving on, we really need to think about some systematic design. One thing I think should be focused is renewable charging contract. So if, for example, if I have a battery in an island, I want to recharge from a wind farm in the North Zone, I should be able to do that. And of course, this will be a highly opportunistically, because it depends on how much wind energy is available, and then there is also this transmission bottleneck. Okay, but we should be able to make that happen. But now in the current electricity market, contract is only financial. Okay, and if I use the Apple example again, so if you imagine that in reality you sign a contract to buy some apple for some apple farm, you get the apple delivered by that farm, but in electricity market, it will be you sign contract with the farm producer, with the apple farm, and then the way you actually execute the contract is you go to the supermarket, to supermarket near you, and you just buy the apple, and then that apple farm will pay you the difference. It is a purely financial contract, and the whole idea is because electricity is homogeneous. There's no difference with electricity. Okay, and the system operator, moving on, really needs to acknowledge electricity diversity and facilitate bilateral transactions and deliveries. Okay, and especially the delivery part is not happening now. Okay. Yep. That's all. I think took longer than I thought, but yeah, let's see. Questions?
I don't have any in the chat yet.
Okay. Thanks, Rena.
Bolun,
yeah, you can.
I have a question.
Oh, hi Naga. Hi.
Very nice presentation, by the way.
Yeah, thanks.
I like the logic and very clear message and articulation. I have a question. I come from the mining world, and the mining industry, as you know, is it is in remote areas, and they don't have infrastructure there, so there is an enormous amount of upfront investment to build the infrastructure, transmission lines, and all of that. And they're just beginning to, many countries and many companies, especially in remote areas, they are thinking about these types of concepts, whether to have a local generator or not. If you have a local generator, renewable energy, how will my operation look like? What would the cost economic situation model is going to be? Do I save anything, or, and so on? So in a mining context, instead of building an infrastructure, or two scenarios, right? One is you have an infrastructure already built. Now I have to retrofit. Let's say I decide to use renewable. What am I going to do? I've already sunk cost there. The other one is the new mines, when you have to, instead of building the transmission lines and the infrastructure, can I have a local generator? I don't know the answer, but my question is, what would the economic factors look like in a local generator supplying the energy, and will it look attractive or not? I don't know the answer.
Yeah. I think that's a good point, and actually that is what we call renewable microgrid. Okay, so basically what you're talking about is a microgrid, right?
Yes.
So and this is currently I don't okay yeah, I think mining is one of the applications starting to emerge, but as actually the first application of this kind of system is military business for microgrid. And okay, and actually the good point is if you install renewable there, you don't need to transmit fuel. Okay, because
yes,
if you imagine this is very remote, so
yep.
you also need the capacity to move fuel
Absolutely.
there.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think the normal business case in this is PV. I don't think wind may be less viable, but PV storage, and you have some backup diesel generator, and then basically these three forms not only sustainable, but it's sustainable, it's reliable because you have the backup diesel generator, and also the thing can run on its own for quite a long time. So this is becoming, I think, a viable business concept, and I think it should be also it should be promising if to use it for mining. Yeah.
Yep. And I'll discuss later. Maybe you can think about it some more, and I would appreciate your thoughts on this.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Bolun, I had a question, Vijay.
Oh, Vijay, hi, good to see you here. Hi.
It's certainly more fun than all the other things to do on a Friday afternoon. Okay. So,
Okay.
hey, one question, how do you see that if you remove something like the production tax credit or the state incentive from, let's say, wind, how would it change both how the wind guy will price their product and how that will change storage or emissions from that?
Yeah, Vijay, that's actually a very, very, very good point. And actually, this relates to the problem of how do we recover investment from renewable generators? Because we mentioned earlier, this is, the market is based on marginal production cost. And the renewable has no marginal production cost. So if you are renewable, you bid into the market, you have to bid zero or something very close to zero, okay? And the current business model is renewable have to rely on tax credit incentive to make up its investment. Okay. Now, if we remove tax credit, the first question is how should renewable make back its investment cost, especially considering we may have a lot of renewables. So everybody's just bidding like their true marginal cost. The market price will be zero or somewhere very close to zero. It's very for a long time, and then and one possible way is maybe we can just acknowledge renewable to counting some of their investment into their market price, and that will probably then the problem is we can no longer differentiate the marginal fuel simply based on the price in that case. And then that's why we really need in that scenario we really need some systematic way of incentivize of using storage to mitigate to integrate renewable energy. On the other hand, another possible way is contracting. As I mentioned, we should be able to sign some delivery contract. So the renewable, as I mentioned, is not reliable generation resource, but also we have a lot of applications that are not requiring a reliable supply. Storage charging, EV charging. For example, New York is electrifying, trying to change all their bus fleet into electric, and charging those buses, you can use renewable. You can use intermittent power supply to charge those electric buses. And also there are some other application. I think farming maybe is another example that it does not need to be reliable. So this is really come down to the business model, and we need to make the system dispatch aware of the resource differences here. Yeah.
Thank you.
I
Yes.
have a follow-up question onto this. This is Kinnery here.
Hi, Kinnery.
At what point, because renewable producers bid into the market, they bid low, and you have like natural gas peakers and those kinds of folks bidding at the higher end, and the renewables are profiting based off of that. So I have a two-part question. The first is, at what point in renewable penetration do you start to see the fact that the market price coming down and down more and more, that it's less incentivized to bid at zero? Does that ever happen? And then my second question is, I would think that because capital investment and thinking about, your return on profit is such a big part of putting renewables in the ground, like intuitively I would think, if you can have public control over electricity generation, then you can lower what your necessary return on investment is, and you could maybe push forward some renewables. But I have friends who work in the space who say that, actually deregulated markets end up having more renewable penetration than necessarily regulated markets. And I don't know anything about that space. So if you have maybe some comments on whether or not that would play into renewable and battery penetration, regulated market versus a deregulated market.
Okay. Thanks, Canary, for the question. So first question is about why went bid zero? Is it?
Well, it's more, at what point in renewable penetration would you not bid zero, or does that never happen?
Yeah. That's a good point. Actually, the reason that the bid zero is actually based on the current market rule. They are not allowed to bid anything much higher than zero. Okay, so this is something. So although we call it electricity market, but this is actually a highly regulated market, and the system operator will monitor and they call it market power mitigation. That will you need to justify why you bid at a higher price. Okay, and so now, of course, actually now, because of tax credits, renewable in many cases they're bidding negative, and they're bidding like sometimes negative $150 per megawatt hour, and that's why you see the prices can go negative. Okay, so once we have more renewable, if we remove the tax credit, the renewable will under the current market rule, they can only bid zero or something very close to zero. Okay, and that actually do not change if we have more renewable. But one thing, and this is actually something that's undergoing active research, is if we install energy storage next to the, not necessarily next, but for example, contract. Okay, we contract one renewable with one storage, and we make, by combining these two, we make the overall generation reliable. Okay, now basically we are forming a virtual power plant. Then can we count in part of the cost from operating the battery into the total marginal cost? In that case, we can bid more, yeah. And then again, this also depends on the market rule. And this is a kind of amazing, but really now, if you're participating in the electricity market, it's not like any free market. You can bid whatever you want and accept market competition. Because we don't have sufficient competition and we have the constraint of grid. Really, how much you can bid is very limited. This is kind of interesting. Although we call it a market, but this market is highly regulated. Okay. And moving on to your second point, the effectiveness of market integrating of a system, whether it's a vertically integrated central system versus market integrated renewable. Actually, I think that impression is somewhere correct. And deregulated market are better at integrating renewable than centralized system. And of course now actually the biggest vertically integrated market system is China, and many other countries are using are having markets. So in China, I think now it's getting a little bit better, but there has been a period that a lot of renewables are not able to get integrated into the system, and that actually it is a two-part problem. One is there has been some overshoot in renewable installation. So basically, the government is providing a too much incentive for building renewable, but didn't give the enough change to integrate those. Okay, and the second, if you're taking the perspective of the system operator, the overall cost of integrating renewable may be actually pretty high, and it needs some infrastructure changes. Okay, and so from their perspective, if you're a grid operator, actually this is also true in US. Also, the grid operator, they hate renewables. They think it is causing a lot of trouble. But because in the US or in many other places in the world, we have a market and the renewable is bidding zero or negative into the market, then based on the economic metrics, it is their duty to integrate renewables, because it's cheaper resources need to get cleared first. Okay, and this is actually one of the so in my talk I mentioned the homogeneity of electricity is kind of penalizing storage to integrate renewable energy. But on the other hand, because of this rule, because we cannot in electricity market, this is called fuel neutrality. So you cannot discriminate electricity generated from different fuels. Okay, and so although wind, solar, renewable generations are not so reliable, the intermittent, but because of they're cheap, it's really a system operator's obligation to integrate as much renewable as possible. So in that case, I think this is correct, and deregulated market are better at integrating renewable, which actually goes back to one of the incentives when the electricity market is invented, is to encourage new technologies. Yeah.
Thank you. Edward has a question as well. He has
thank you. Yeah, thank you, Bolun. So I'm biased here because of what I do and what I've chosen to do, but whenever I appreciate you clearly demarcating areas where storage increases emissions versus decreases emissions. But the argument I would make whenever I see this, and I'm not arguing that this isn't the case, but I think this is the case because the current grid structure emphasizes power over energy. And by that, I mean, it's been so well tuned to only produce power on demand that we live with the inefficiencies and we live with the just-in-time nature. And when I look at your example of frequency regulation, you're absolutely right. If the frequency regulation is buffered by a gas-fired or coal-powered plant, and you have to put energy into the battery to get the energy out of the battery, then yes, you're going to be burning more fuel at the source to get that done. But I'm always left with this, and here's the question. That's my comment, and here's the question. If I were to mandate that you just needed 2 hours of storage, that you look at this, because there's a lot of data as to how much power is needed when and where. and you said that on average, you have to be able to supply 2 hours of storage, it seems to me that most of those inefficiencies would go away. If every grid operator had to have 2 hours of storage everywhere, and I'm obviously, because of what I do, I want this to be the case. But do you think that that would solve X amount of problems? If that was just, if there was no, you know, in addition to the market structure and all of this, there had to be everywhere 2 hours of storage, regardless of where the power was coming in to begin with, what would happen?
Yeah, good point, Dan. Actually, I would make that analog to, I want to say, okay, compared to 2 hours of storage everywhere, that basically I'm taking this as we have a sufficient amount of storage everywhere.
Sure.
We can simply move to Norway and see what they are doing. They have sufficient amount of storage everywhere. And the interesting thing is with storage, once you have more storage there, the operation gets much easier because you can imagine you can live with more simpler control because you have because you have more storage, you have a larger tolerance based on, as I mentioned, the whole thing is based on forecast, based on to predict what's going to happen and prepare the storage for it. When you have a larger storage, everything is getting easier. Okay, and so yeah, I would say once we reach the end goal, we have a lot of renewable, a lot of storage. Actually, the system it will be actually easier to operate. But on the other hand, we may need to come up with an entirely different market design. The current marginal pricing scheme may not really work anymore. Yeah.
And I guess that's the core of my question, because, you know, we don't let the banks operate this way. If the banks had, like, you know, if we think about the banks having the amount of capital on hand, like this is what led to the credit freeze in 2008, if I understand it correctly, when there just wasn't enough momentary credit available, the entire market locked up. And so now we do stress tests, and there has to be so much in reserve in order to make a given trade. And it seems to me that if you put a similar market rule in, that anyone who's bidding into the market had to be able to provide that for a certain amount of time, it would effectively dictate that you need to have a certain amount of storage. And the market design could evolve towards.
Okay, so basically you mean
sense?
that, yeah, basically you mean so if you're renewable bidding into the market, you need to take care of your unreliability. Is that what you mean here?
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
if you're a peaker, you have to account for your carbon emissions, right? So if you put a carbon tax and a duration tax, or a duration mandate with a carbon tax, it seems like you could take the given marginal market structure, but modify it in such a way where you would get the externalities accounted for the way you might want.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right with this too, actually, and I think the really thing is we really need to. So there are many items here, and we need to coordinate to move everything coordinately in pace. Okay. But your comment on renewable taking of their own reliability, this is actually something people are realizing now. But as I mentioned earlier, the obstacle here, as I talked to many system operators, is really the fuel neutrality. The kind of thing, if we ask renewables to take care of their reliability, we are basically implying they are not reliable. And then we are discriminating against renewable generators. Okay, of course this sounds a little bit absurd, but I think this is what they're thinking. This is against the fuel neutral. But this is changing, and this is why we are.
But my comment there, and this is really just to invoke VJ, is that you can't say that wind is 2 cents per kilowatt hour, but you have to take it when you can get it. You have to average it out and say wind is really 9 cents a kilowatt hour.
Yeah,
and that at least gives us a target for the battery being, you know, an LCOS of 5 or 6 or 8, or whatever it needs to be.
Yeah, for example, you can you can make another like a reliability standard, right? And then when the wind generator need to either buy a battery or contract with a battery or some other technology to make their overall generation reliable, and then you can contain that cost into their production cost. And I think this is something we are moving forward. I'm not sure how quickly, but at least this is I think this is the direction we should be moving to. Yeah.
Cool.